Now, before I introduce Andrew, I'd like to take my opportunity at the lectern to make a few brief comments and remarks. I'm not sure if everyone in the audience is aware of Flora's long and deep involvement with the University of Sydney. Flora moved to Sydney and commenced working in the Faculty of Economics in December 1976 and worked at the university for her entire career before retiring in the year 2000. Although formally retiring, Flora continued to teach economics for a further 8 years. And as demonstrated by the launch this evening of Flora's book, Flora has remained an active scholar. And on a personal note, I first met Flora when I was a student here, back last century. And Flora stood out at that time as somebody who took a genuine interest in her students, even a very quiet and introspective student such as myself. Flora taught an exceptionally diverse range of subjects, from introductory micro to advanced micro theory, economic statistics and econometrics, quant methods to labour economics, and the history of economic thought. One additional subject that stood out for me was the subject Flora taught on the economics of income distribution. This subject covered the functional and personal distribution of income and included an in-depth study of the foundational work by Atkinson on the measurement of income and poverty, and the related works by Sen, Stiglitz, Irma Edelman, and many others. This subject, in fact, had a profound impact on me and my career. It demonstrated to me that economics as a discipline had a great deal to say about economic inequality, poverty, and welfare. We studied at that time inequality and inequality measurement analytically, as well as looking at empirical applications. This then drove my work as a PhD student and it has driven my research agenda since then. I guess of the series of papers that I've published, many in collaboration with Stephen Donald, who's also a graduate of Sydney Economics, has been in developing econometric methods for analysing Lorentz dominance and stochastic dominance relations, which then provide a robust measurement of inequality and poverty. And we've applied this to analyse and evaluate social policies that are aimed at alleviating poverty and the promotion of equity and fairness. So on a personal note, Flora's teachings has had an enduring impact on my career and the career of my colleagues and many cohorts of students. So on a personal note, I'd like to thank Flora for her education of many cohorts of students at Sydney and for sharing her recent scholarship, which is captured in her book that we'll discuss tonight, Work and Social Justice. And on that note, I'd like to turn over to Andrew, who will give a further introduction to Flora's work.
Thank you very much, Gary, and I associate myself with your acknowledgement of country and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, the Gadigal people. It's such a pleasure to be here today to be part of this launch of Flora's book, Work and Social Justice, Rethinking Labour in Society and the Economy. It's a terrific book and it reflects a lifetime of thoughtfulness and scholarship. And can I begin by saying how wonderful it is to be in this room with this group of people. I feel like we probably all have at least two things in common. We're all attached to Flora's scholarship and her ideas, but we're also all attached to Flora personally, as a student, as a friend, as a family member, as a colleague. And I'm lucky enough to be attached to Flora in at least two of those ways, I hope, as a former student and now as a friend. I first met Flora when I was studying at the University of Sydney, and at that time I was very keen. I was thoroughly enthralled in the study of economics. I remember I had just read Robert Skidelsky's 3-volume biography of John Maynard Keynes. And in the first volume, he describes the emergence of economics in the 19th century at Cambridge as the study of moral sciences. And he talks about how those early moral scientists were drawing together the threads of Enlightenment principles and methods in order to build a new science that could help society manage its resources and adjudicate its trade-offs. And I thought that was the science for me. Although I loved studying economics in the late 1990s, I couldn't help but thinking that somehow I wasn't at Sydney University Economics at the most exciting time. In the late 1990s, maybe it was the drab architecture of the Merriweather building that wasn't calculated to excite. I remember in my second year, you might remember this too, Flora, they had repainted all of the beige corridors of the Merriweather building in a bright red, and one of the lecturers explained that the colour choice was made to wake the students up. I thought that's exactly what they need. But maybe more deeply, the pyrotechnics of the economics faculty wars that had so sensationally consumed Sydney University Economics were mostly over. I have to say, much to my chagrin. The titanic figures of that battle, Hogan, Stilwell and others, by the time I arrived, unfortunately for me, were in various stages of retirement and mellowing. And indeed, economics had reached something of a consensus, a new consensus, the Washington Consensus, which, again, somewhat disappointingly for me, explained that the best thing we can do for markets is to leave them alone. And we were also in the middle of this particularly benign set of economic conditions, what Ben Bernanke would later go on to describe as the NICE decade, the NICE decade, the non-inflationary, consistently expansionary decade. And it was in this environment that I met Flora Gill. Her eyes sparkled, she spoke at 1,000,000 miles an hour, and with a thick accent that made you feel like everything she told you was a valuable secret that you had to put in before she moved on to the next topic and you missed it forever. Flora was unlike any of the other faculty members that I met, and there were many other wonderful faculty members, but Flora stood out to me because she was a member of the economics faculty rather than economics as a social science, and yet her views were unfalteringly heterodox. She hadn't taken any hyper-partisan positions in the debates and disputes. In fact, she seemed to sit with one group and yet have great sympathy for the other. And for me, this was instantly appealing. I remember spending hours in Flora's office talking about all manner of economics and political topics. And, you know, they say that you don't remember what you say to people, but you remember how they made you feel. And I have to say, with 20 years of passing, I've forgotten almost all of the things that we talked about in those hours many years ago. But I do remember feeling two things. First, as an ordinary student at Sydney University, I remember that Flora made me feel as if I mattered to her, as if she was happy to help all of her students beyond the hours of the lecture or the tutorial. She made me feel like there was no ticking clock, and she was as excited as I was about the discussions that we were having. And the second thing I remember, and really this I've carried with me all of my life, is she made me feel that rigorous economics need not be heartless economics. Because the new economics that had formed in the preceding decades was in many ways an austere discipline, run by men, and they were mostly men, who at times seemed to value their mathematics more than their empathy. As I went on to my own graduate study, there was a bit of a vibe in the academic world amongst some of the economists that I met who seemed to frown upon their colleagues who they thought were guided more, and who they worried were guided by sentiment rather than equations. But for me, Flora was very different. Flora valued rigor as well as values. And so for me, reading Flora's book transported me back through those decades, back to that office in Merriweather, back to the conversations that we had many times. And it reminded me of all the good heart and all the good sense of those conversations. Because in this book, Flora invites economists and policymakers and members of the public to consider some very important questions. How can we reconceptualize paid work to achieve greater social equity? What can we do to correct the current trajectory of progressive policies which have faltered in recent decades? Will we adapt to technological progress, or will we allow it to erode employment prospects across many industries? And these are compelling questions, and Flora in her book examines them insightfully in a work which advocates for social justice embedded in a modern economy. It was exactly what I remembered from Flora's worldview, the worldview that she stamped on me and so many other students. She points out in the book that since the Industrial Revolution, Western economies have undergone considerable progress in the pursuit of social justice and equity, whether that be public health, education services, workplace health and safety laws, minimum wages, 8-hour workdays. And she reminds us, importantly, particularly importantly for me in my current job, that these reforms were fought long and hard for, and that social justice in the workplace is not easy to achieve. It's not done with the stroke of a pen or the waving of a wand. It takes hard work. And this reminder is particularly pertinent today when modern economies are facing a wide set of challenges. Concern around the rise of AI and whether the opportunities presented by automation will reduce our safety and security at work. Economic threats posed by many new issues, including global warming. And Flora's book closely addresses these challenges and more. As she says herself, this work is a clarion call for justice and a declaration that economists must expand their perspective on paid work beyond the confines of modern theory to help improve labour market outcomes into the future. I was pleased when I read the book to see that Laura continues to expose many of the problems experienced in modern economics. The first is the occasional over-reliance on mathematics when interpreting social and economic phenomena. As American economist Paul Krugman said, and is cited in the book, the economics profession went astray because economists as a group mistook beauty clad in impressive-looking mathematics for truth. And a similar point applies when economists rationalise inadequate social welfare investment by pointing to a supposed trade-off between social equity and economic efficiency, a trade-off that Flora deplores and says is a mistake. When it comes to social equity, Western economies have come a long way, whether it be primary school or introduction of public utilities. Many triumphant victories have been won by organised labour and trade union movements. But despite these successes, Flora points out, we still have a long way to go. And the book posits that since neoliberalism became the guiding economic philosophy in the Western world, the appetite for social justice among policymakers has dwindled while our challenges have mounted. Since the 1970s, trade unions around the world have been attacked by governments and others who have then simultaneously installed punitive social welfare policies, hanging the unemployed out to dry while enabling narratives which accuse them of dole bludgeoning. And she cites examples from Australia which are pertinent to this. She cites the suppression of wages, the decline of collective bargaining, and vast labour market deregulation, all of which has resulted in less stable working conditions and poorer pay. And this, of course, brings us to the challenges facing the economy today, where I think this book is extremely relevant. How do we address the increasing adoption of automation in the workplace? How do we counteract the effects of climate change? Will paid work ever be reconceptualised to capture social justice? And for Flora, the task rests on the shoulders of two authorities, the government and society. She says governments have a responsibility to create security and equity for workers. And Flora sees a potential future where workers are recognised across society as a key stakeholder in business, thus providing them greater influence in determining their working conditions. Many of these challenges are more political than economic, and hence, if we are to reconceptualise work in the way that Flora encourages us to do so, we must rise to these challenges as a democratic society. As I outlined in my foreword for the book, I think this is a must-read for anyone interested in the future of work, and for anyone who is concerned about the future of social justice. Flora's analysis is digestible, it's well-researched, and it is compelling. She makes the point that economic policy does not need to be restricted by the decades-old ideological confines. In fact, she offers us every opportunity to reinvigorate the cause of social equity and justice. And that's why I'm confident that this book will serve as a source of inspiration for a new generation of future young economists and leaders, and I'm so grateful for the opportunity to participate in the launch today. Thank you, Flora.
Thank you, Andrew. Flora, an opportunity for you to share some.
I don't think I would talk about the book at all with the motivation, because I cannot do as good job as Andrew did. So I can skip it. I want to thank Gary at the Department of Economics here at the School of Social Science, and Andrew, and also Jana in due course for the ones that they have had and going to. I'm sorry, I'm too excited in organizing this event, and for the immense pleasure that them and many other students have given me throughout my 3 decades of teaching at the University of Sydney. It was sometimes tough. It wasn't always a pleasurable dance, but it was also very rewarding and not too infrequently. So I thank to everybody present or not. Now, the only thing I want to add is an obsession that I have. It's not in my notes, so I'm ignoring the notes now. And that is that too often we hear from politicians that the challenges we face are insurmountable because there are economic challenges that nothing can be done about them, or there are technological transformation that again, nothing can be done about them. And the truth is that they are political challenges. And the way to look at it is to look at the cross-section of various Western economies and how they each handle those challenges. And we discovered great diversity there. And that tells us quite readily that the real and only challenge in my mind is the political challenge. How do you get the politics that can handle those challenges in a way that benefits the vast majority of members of society? And the statistics of unequal income and inequality of wealth ownership since the late 70s tells the story of the unfortunate way that politics has handled these challenges. The last thing I want to say that Andrew did talk about it a fair bit, but I want to re-emphasize it. There are many issues that economics cannot handle alone. It has to draw insights from a whole spate of intellectual frameworks that exist within academia, including medical scholarship, philosophical discourse on the use and abuse of power, history, and much more. All this is addressed in the book. And the book is in fact, this is my last sentence, is the result of study program that I arranged for me when I stopped teaching. And the study program is to learn what other disciplines have to say about the role that role plays in our life and the impact that it has, not only on our pocket, but also on our emotional and physical well-being. Thank you so much, all of you, for coming here. It means to me a lot to be able to share this celebration with all of you, and you're all incredible friends, everyone who's single one of you. All the best.
I have a few themes I identified in the book that I would like to put to you as panel members, and I'm interested in different perspectives on that. Okay. And I'm also interested in the themes that you highlight as well, but I'll come to that later. So first off, the theme that's been touched on in the presentations already is this economics over-reliance upon mathematics. Interestingly, this year marks the tercentenary of Adam Smith's birth, who's seen as the founder of modern economics. And there's been a series of celebrations and public lectures relating to that. One very good one was presented by a colleague, Tony Athromoris. And he reflected upon the development of history of economic ideas and said, you know, Adam Smith was a humanist and was very didactic, taking economics and drawing upon all of these different fields and bringing it together in this sort of coherent framework. And he identified Ricardo as somebody who was a deductive logician, and it really changed the nature and development and had a long-term impact on economics. And so my question to members on the panel is, do you see that still really confining and constraining economics as a discipline, or do you see it much broader and flourishing and drawing upon different disciplines today? So, Flora, in a nutshell, what would you say?
Do you want me to do first?
Sure.
I don't have to. Really, people heard my voice. It can be exactly the other way.
It's a secret. I mean, it's not a secret.
Okay. So Adam Smith, as I say in the book, I think in introductory chapter, notwithstanding his fame as the champion of free markets, actually has a most beautiful description of unequal bargaining that separates them, the average worker, from their employer. And it's absolutely beautiful, and it's cited in the book. In his book, The Theory of Moral Sentiment, that he published, in fact, before, I think, The Wealth of Nations in 1854, or thereabouts, he talks beautifully about the pain that poor people suffer knowing that their social status in society is so low. And I do cite literature that describes the ideas that 19th century economists have about the roots and origins of poverty. For instance, for economists, I cite Nasser Senior, who say that the poor will become very well off when with a bit of exaggeration, when they learn how to work hard and stop being lazy. That's in the
well,
You
I
can
mean,
summarize.
I guess, when you hear just Flora talk now, since we're among friends and people who know Flora very well, one of the things that you kind of, get a sense for in the book, which is, one of the reasons why I would commend it to you, is that reading the book is a little bit like, having a conversation with Flora. She basically kind of, draws on various strands of academic literature, current affairs, and she kind of weaves them into a discourse that moves from one, argument to another in a seamless way, and it's, and you kind of feel invigorated by having done it. So the question that Gary posed was actually one of the questions that I had posed to Flora after having read the book in Word format. And she said, well, what do you think about it? Do you agree with it, or do you have some problems with it? And I said, well, I largely agree with it. I'm, I guess, among friends of, being a former student of Flora's. although I guess I'm the only lawyer in the room and probably the only person who thinks Merriweather was a well-designed. So I said, well, I'm not entirely sure, what you say about economic methodology, because, you say that it's a book of heterodox economic methodology, but at the same time you acknowledge that actually much of the literature from within orthodox economics basically makes the points that, markets tend to fail. I said to her, it's the kind of like, there's even a neoclassical road to socialism, probably, if you really insist. But then on the other hand, you say that, maths doesn't capture everything, and there are all of these insights that, cannot be, or have not so far been incorporated in economic models. So what do you think? Do you think that economics should have the ambition to be able to model everything through mathematical techniques, or do you think that there is a limit to that process? And I guess if I can try to anticipate what Flora might say is that mathematical modeling can provide a lot of insight and can basically lead us to the kinds of conclusions that she's leading us towards in this book. But at the same time, if you try to incorporate all of the insights from either other disciplines or from kind of empirical observation of the world into economic models through mathematics, it will be too cumbersome and tedious. It will not always be possible, and you will always basically have to sort of choose to obscure some things that are bothering you or that you're observing, but that you cannot account for through those methodologies. So I think that she, as she herself said, she's not opposed to it, but she recognizes that there are limits and that the ability of economics to speak to the issues of the day should not be limited by its ability to account for in a stylish way for the phenomena that we observe. We cannot sort of, as we all have a tendency to do, look at the past with rose-colored glasses. And Flora emphatically said to me that she's not one of these people that wants to engage in nostalgia. So it's not about looking for the past and thinking about how we can revive past models because of the good old days. It's actually about really being quite frank about failure. And so the welfare state had many, many virtuous effects in my view, but it also had its own failures. Our attempts to reimagine it in a kind of market mode might have had some good reasons behind it, I would say, but it also has now we can sort of see that it's also had some failures. So I think that we have to be very frank about failure, and we're not very good at that in our political culture, and just acknowledging that something didn't go right. In trying to think about the future, I think we can't really look to the past and see or simply look to other jurisdictions and say, oh, they seem to have the right answer. Because once you look into their right answer, you tend to see that they have lots of problems as well. So you have to kind of be very, very frank about the things that don't work. And I'm not sure that we are prepared to do that in our political discourse.
Flora, thoughts on your optimism for the future of the world?
Oh, I think that people have to read the book, and the idea
Yes,
is
the
to
book will be
inspire
available for
them.
sale.
The idea is to inspire them to come to think about the problem. We live in democracy, and to think about it in the way they, from their own experience, from their own observation. The very first, I think it's the first page, no, it's the last page of the introduction, say the book intends to start a conversation. The word conversation there is openly. And I think we're having a conversation. And we should all listen. And then we'll go home with much more than in the book. It's wonderful. I don't think I'm nostalgic. That's the only thing I will say, and the rest, people who read the book can decide for themselves.
I'll briefly hand over 2 questions from the audience. Before I do, if I ask each of the panel members, Jana, Andrew, is there a particular theme that struck and accord with you that you would like to share?
Yeah, I mean, you know, so the theme, you know, in a way, Flora foreshadowed it in what she just said. The theme is actually one of optimism, and that's, you know, in the times that we live in, you know, that's actually sort of, you know, quite a, you know, quite a tall order to achieve that. You know, you come away from reading this book with thinking that, you know, there are actually lots of opportunities for meaningful and purposeful, you know, policy reform, not motivated by nostalgia, but motivated by the idea that there were examples of past intervention where people achieved well-regulated markets. They didn't achieve them on the first go. But, you know, like Samuel Beckett says, you tried, you failed, you try again, you fail again, but you fail better. And so, you know, it's a basically kind of constant, purposeful action, and you always fail, and you have to be willing to kind of accept that. You know, and it's still, even though it's an existentialist message, being from Beckett, it's actually an optimistic message. And so that's what stands, you know, stays with me from this book.
The last can I say something?
Sure,
the last 3 lines in the book, and say we're on the crossroad. And we can choose to do X, and our children will be the beggars of the land of the lords, and we'll be roaming the world, the forests, if any are left of them. Or alternatively, if we can grab the bull by its proverbial horns, we have this alternative policy option. There is a Hebrew saying, which is the source of my accent, that says, translating it not literally, that only the fool dare to divine the future. So the last thing I'm trying to divine the future, and I'm neither optimistic nor pessimistic. If there is a will, I learned in Australia, there is a way. And it's a plea to read the expose, to be mindful of what really happens within the walls of the workplace. The rampant discriminations along the gender divide, along the ethnic divide, along the religious divide, you name it. And there are full chapters about this. And that work is very rewarding when it's well designed and free of oppressive command structures, but it's very debilitating and undermines not only our emotional health, but also physical wealth, as the medical literature that I bring into the reader exposes to us. And which one will happen? We live in democracy, and we can vote for Party A or Party B, or from new or existing Party C, or some new Party D, and it's up to us. And at the extent to which we are informed about the world we live in. That's my summary. And I won't say one.
Well, I'm from Party L.
Big L or small L?
And the thing that I take out of the book is one of optimism. As Flora says, we are at a crossroads, but she gives us both, I think, the tool and the mood to be positive about our ability to go beyond that crossroads. And that mood is optimism, learning from other disciplines, generosity, and putting all those things together into a framework that can make the world stronger, more compassionate, and better. So that, the thing I take out of it is optimism.
Great. Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, that's for that. I'll now turn over to the audience. Are there questions from the audience they'd like to put to the panel?
I was just wondering what would it actually look like you're saying these policies and things, what are some kind of examples?
Concrete examples.
I don't know, like what does the economy getting better and like being more equal look like?
Wonderful.
So,
To begin with, no homelessness. So public housing, which is not stigmatizing for all who need it. Work, full employment for everybody who wants to work. And it's possible because our aged care places are starving for truly qualified workers. And schools can do with smaller classes, or at least more teachers that are as qualified as, let's say, Finland. We have a lot to learn from Finland about the teaching system. We have a lot to learn from the Nordic countries about training. So I cite in the book an article that appeared in The Guardian in 2018 by somebody whose surname was Gross, written with one S at the end. And he says the following: which is the country you would love to have lost your job? And the answer is Sweden. Why? Because you will be retrained and equipped with new earning skills that will earn you higher income that you previously had. Sweden was a place where in 1934 a bystander 14-year-old was killed when the army was sent against striking workers. And then 2 years later, a man whose surname was Wigforss, forgot his first name, came to power, and he was extreme socialist, but he said, we won't wait for the revolution. We can at least get better deal from capitalism, and lay the foundation with Professor Gesteren from the Stockholm School of Economics, who I met in 1994. And Rudolf Meiner was the head of the LO, which was the ACTU of Sweden at the time. And they had very high tax levels, and they sent very, very efficient retraining system where within 4 months or so, deep sea fishers from the north and lumber workers who felled trees in the north were transformed into top metal industry workers. In Australia, we call them fitter and turners. Subsequently, luckily for Sweden, they were neutral during the war, the Second World War. So half of their manufacturing was machine building machines and various other machines. And that was half of their export. And to this day, Sweden has high taxes, wonderful public housing, wonderful public health system, and very only public, as far as I know, public education system. Yes, they have had their right-wing governments too, but their society believes in certain minimum which must prevail no matter who runs the country. So the book talks a lot about retraining, as did my lectures when I was teaching at the University of Sydney. It's a huge potential, but it should not be done through TAFE. The people who are the top in their métier should teach within 4, 5, 6 months, small group of adult retrenched workers, and equip them with new skills. As usual, my answers are too long.
I'll move on to the second question. Other question? I'm not going to hear them.
Okay. There's this one player on this wonderful stage that's not been named, and that's the media. So any wonderful, progressive and very sensible economic policy is likely to be completely made very unpopular by people who read the Murdoch media, basically. So so Flora, how do we deal with that? Okay, that's obviously a huge question, and maybe Andrew can shed some light, because even a very sensible, very incredibly well-informed policy like a price on carbon, which is the most sensible way, the simplest way to actually start to address that externality of carbon pollution. It's like you can't even say the words. Like, I feel awkward saying the words in this room. Like, it's like taboo. It's crazy how, and that fear has been generated by this other player, this media player.
Now in this room, I think you can safely say.
So I'd love Flora's thoughts on that, and also the other panel members as well.
This is, she was my doctor in the rehab hospital. Helen Raymond, and she has been ever since I don't know how many years a fighter for global warming. And her partner is boldly surprised that she asked this question, because when he lovingly describes her, she is 100% fighter against global warming and the medical impact of global warming too. Am I right?
Yes, you're right. Spot on.
I don't know. When I was teaching some decades ago, I don't know who remembers this, journalists used to consult academic economists. They just once, published even my photographic paper. And people like Frank Stilwell and others from the political economies were often being interviewed. It is at least 20 years now, if I'm right, that only economists who work for big corporations in the big banks are interviewed and are introduced as an economist said. Have you been interviewed by newspapers?
I have, actually. I get many requests for newspapers, television, or social media.
Okay,
as well.
is that often in the department? I did, because I read the Herald quite, and the Guardian, I read them today, inside out. In the Guardian today, I read an article about women in Iceland that are still, 95% of them went on strike in 1975 against the gender pay gap. And even in Iceland, the gender pay gap is alive and well. It's an article in today's Guardian. So, but I have not seen articles by academic economists. I don't know it. They might be talking to you, but don't worry.
I've been approached by the Australian, but many media organisations.
Oh, just Australians are not to it.
I'd be interested in Andrew's thoughts on rogue media, mainstream media.
Yeah, look, I think I worked in politics 15 years ago and I'm back, and the biggest change I think is the media landscape. The biggest change I observe. And the biggest feature of that media landscape is not so much the positions of the big media organisations, but I think the role of social media. You know, I was standing on the polling booth on referendum day a week or so ago, and the number of people streaming past whose most of what they knew about the referendum they had picked up on TikTok. Now, I don't have anything particular against TikTok or picking up news in a visual video format, but the scope for misinformation, disinformation, and the incentives within those algorithms to highlight and put a spotlight on extreme views, I do think is really deeply problematic.
I agree.
And I saw something in that referendum, independent of the outcome, that made me very fearful about the future of our political discourse as mediated by social media. And I think that's a big challenge for us, and a challenge we're going to have to work through.
Well, I mean, I guess, I would say a couple of things there. So it actually goes back to this question of kind of, what is it that propagates the, let's say the neoliberal policy prescription that, in some ways Flora decries in her book. So there are a lot of conventional economists who basically say, look, markets are generally very emancipatory institutions, but we don't live in a world of markets, but we live in a world of crony capitalism. And part of their argument is the media argument, right? The fact that basically, in a concentrated media environment, you kind of tend to basically get a particular message. And that Flora, in her book, also nicely takes to task the economics profession, what she calls the textbook economics, which is, as I understand it, people who are not necessarily, either kind of willing to refer to kind of more advanced work in economics that points to market failure, but who kind of just hold on to simple policy prescriptions about free markets are good, government regulation is bad, as a way of kind of propagating a certain set of policies, which could apply to climate change just as much because it does rely on kind of heavy government intervention. I think that Andrew's point is interesting because it kind of says, well, it's not just about concentrated media, and maybe that's actually having a marginal effect on the discourse, but there is this kind of other pathway through which these messages are propagated. And how is it that they're propagated, and who is it that propagates them? Is it connected to media ownership or something else? I guess we sort of all start to become kind of in danger of becoming kind of conspiracy theorists of a different kind. So why is it that social media propagates a particular type of worldview? And is that because of this kind of idea that there are the losers from the years of neoliberalism who now are kind of open to a particular type of messaging, which is perversely anti-progressive?
Thank you. Actually, almost out of time, so can you hold your question and share it with the panel after we close? I wanted to close off the formalities so we have plenty of time to continue with our informal discussion. Before doing that, I'd like to acknowledge the people who worked behind the scenes to make this evening occur. In particular, I'd like to thank my colleague Kath Placencia, who's organised tonight. So thank you, Kath. We've been ably assisted with my colleague Richard Davies as well. And most importantly, I'd also like a special thank you to Flora for her exceptional career educating many of us and for sharing her deep insights into the nature of work in her book, Work and Social Justice, which is actually on sale. Sorry to give you a sign.
It's don't go to Demo because they charge $210. Anybody who wants me to sell it to them, I'm charged $92.50 for book, but I sell it at $90. That's beautiful discount, $2.50. I have only 5 copies because New South Wales, University of New South Wales publisher received the payment 4 weeks ago, but something that happened there, and the publication got delayed. So I have a page somewhere where you can even, somewhere it exists, you can write your name if not on the back of this page, and your email and your telephone address, and when I get the copies, I will mail it to you. And otherwise, you can have an ebook that you can buy in Australia and New Zealand. That's what the publisher told me. This book is available as an ebook, and when I Googled it, you can still get it for an expensive price of $59. So, otherwise, just borrow it from me, and you can return it when you're finished.
Well, thank you.